The phone rang at 2:47 a.m., jolting me awake. I fumbled for it in the dark, knocking over my water glass. "Marcus," Ben's voice cracked through the speaker. "Jesus, Marcus, you need to get down here. Now." I sat up, instantly awake. Ben Crawford didn't call unless something was seriously wrong. We'd been friends since community college, and in all those years, I'd never heard his voice shake like that. "What's going on? Are you hurt?" "No, Fuck, I don't know how to explain this." His breathing was ragged. "We pulled something up tonight. Something that shouldn't exist." I checked the clock again. "Ben, it's almost 3 in the morning." "I know what time it is." The sharpness in his voice made me flinch. "Look, I'm sorry, but this can't wait. We're at Pier 47, the Northern Star. Just please come." The line went dead. Sarah moved next to me. "Everything okay?" "Ben needs help with something." I was already reaching for my clothes. "Go back to sleep." She mumbled something and rolled over. I dressed quickly, grabbed my keys, and headed out into the Seattle night. The drive to the docks took 20 minutes through empty streets. My mind raced through possibilities. Equipment failure, maybe an injury Ben didn't want to report. The fishing industry had its own way of handling problems, especially when Coast Guard involvement might mean lost time and money. But Ben's voice kept playing in my head. That wasn't fear about paperwork or medical bills. That was something else entirely. Pier 47 was darker than usual, most of the overhead lights either broken or switched off. The Northern Star sat low in the water, her deck lights throwing bright patches across the worn planks. I could see figures moving around, but they weren't making the usual noise you'd expect from a crew securing their catch. They were completely silent. I walked up the gangplank, my footsteps bouncing in the stillness. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Salt and fish, but underneath something else. Something rotting and wrong. "Ben?" He came out from behind some crates, and I almost didn't know who I was looking at. Ben was built like a linebacker, the kind of guy who could haul nets in a storm and crack jokes while doing it. Now he looked like he'd aged 10 years in a single night. His face had gone pale, his eyes bloodshot and wide. "You came." He sounded relieved but not happy. "I wasn't sure you would." "Of course I came. What the hell happened out there?" Ben looked around at his crew. 5 men stood scattered across the deck, all of them staring at nothing. They looked like they were in shock. We were working the deep trenches about 60 miles out, dropped our nets deeper than usual because the fish have been scarce. Ben's voice was flat, mechanical. When we hauled them up, this thing came with them. "What kind of thing?" "That's why I called you. You're the scientist. Maybe you can tell me what we're looking at." He took me across the deck, and that's when I saw the blood. Dark stains covered the planks. Way too much blood for a normal fishing operation. My stomach clenched. "Ben, is everyone accounted for?" He stopped walking. "No." The word just sat there between us. I wanted to ask more, but something in his face told me to back off. We'd get to that later. We stopped in front of a huge freezer unit, the kind used for storing big catches. Ben's hand hung over the latch. "Before I open this, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't let this thing get away from you, Marcus. Whatever you do with it, whatever test you run, don't let it spread." The way he said it made my skin crawl. "Spread? Just promise me." "I promise." Ben opened the freezer. The smell hit me first, salt water and rot, but also something sweet and thick that made my throat tighten. Then I saw it, and my brain just wouldn't accept what was right there in front of me. The thing was huge, at least 8 feet wide. a squirming blob of see-through meat that reminded me of a jellyfish pumped full of growth hormones. But that thought died as soon as I got a better look. The creature had tentacles, dozens of them, coiled and twisted around its central body. Each tentacle was thick as my arm, and ended not in suckers or hooks, but in what looked like perfectly formed human hands. Pale, delicate fingers with clean fingernails, as if they'd been surgically attached to this nightmare. One of those hands was still holding something. Tommy Rodriguez's severed head stared back at me with wide, terrified eyes. I stumbled backward, my stomach turning. "Jesus Christ, Ben." "That's Tommy," Ben said quietly. "Kid was 24, been working with us for 6 months. The creature pulsed, its see-through skin rippling with each movement. It was supposed to be dead, had to be dead after hours in the freezer, but it moved like something very much alive. I forced myself to look closer, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. The thing's surface was covered in clusters of eyes, each one about the size of a marble, all of them staring in different directions. Between the eyes were slits that might have been mouths, lipless openings that seemed to whisper sounds I couldn't quite hear. "How long has it been in here?" 3 hours, maybe 4. We iced it down as soon as we got it on deck." "And it's still moving?" "Hasn't stopped." I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, though the camera flash seemed to make the thing pulse faster. "I need samples. Do you have any clean containers?" Ben disappeared and came back with a tackle box full of empty jars. I found a scalpel in the boat's first aid kit and approached the creature again. The moment I got close, something strange happened. The whispering sounds got louder, and I could swear they were forming patterns, like words in a language I'd never heard. More disturbing, I felt pulled toward the thing. Not curious, pulled, like it was calling to me. I shook off the feeling and cut a small piece of tissue from one of the tentacles. The flesh was warm even in the freezing temperature, and it kept twitching after I'd cut it off. I sealed it in a jar, then took samples from different parts of the creature. Each cut made the whispering louder. "We need to get this to the lab," I said, stepping back from the freezer. "I can run preliminary tests, figure out what we're dealing with." "You think you can identify it?" I looked at the samples I was holding. The tissue kept moving, pushing against the glass like it wanted to get out. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like this." Ben nodded and shut the freezer. "What do we do with the body?" "Keep it frozen for now. Don't let anyone else see it, and don't talk about this until I know more." "What about Tommy?" I didn't have an answer for that. How do you tell someone's family that their son died because of something that can't be real? "We'll figure it out," I said, though I had no idea how. Ben walked me back to the gangplank. His crew was still standing around like zombies, not talking, barely moving. "Are they okay?" "They haven't said a word since we pulled that thing up. Just stand there, staring." I studied the men more closely. They all wore the same look, empty, far off, as if they were tuned into something only they could pick up. "Ben, I think you should take them to a hospital." "And tell them what? That we found a sea monster and now my crew's acting weird?" He had a point, but something was definitely off with those guys. "Just keep an eye on them, and call me if anything changes." I headed back to my car, the sample jars carefully packed in a cooler I kept in my trunk. As I drove away from the docks, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. In the rearview mirror, I could see the northern star getting smaller, but Ben's final words kept replaying in my head. "Don't let this thing get away from you, Marcus. It wants to spread." I had no clue what he meant by that, but I was about to find out. I drove straight to the Pacific Research Institute, the sample jars clattering in my passenger seat like they were trying to break free. The building looked different in daylight, cleaner, more professional than the chaotic mess of Ben's fishing boat. But I couldn't get rid of the memory of those human hands gripping Tommy's severed head. Eleanor was already in the lab when I arrived, hunched over a stack of research papers with her usual careful attention. Dr. Eleanor Ambrose had been my research partner for 2 years, and I'd never seen her shaken by anything. She glanced up when I walked in, her dark eyes immediately studying whatever expression I was wearing. "You look terrible, Marcus. When's the last time you slept? I need your help with something." I set the cooler on the lab bench, my hands shaking slightly. Emergency samples from a fishing vessel, unlike anything I've seen before. Eleanor straightened, her scientific curiosity overriding concern about my appearance. "What kind of samples?" I opened the cooler and pulled out the jars. The tissue inside had changed during the drive. What had been small, twitching fragments now filled nearly half of each container. Eleanor stepped closer, adjusting her glasses. "Jesus, Marcus, what is that?" "That's what I need to find out." We worked in silence, preparing microscopic slides with the sterile precision that had become second nature over years of collaboration. But something felt different today. My hands moved with unusual steadiness despite my exhaustion, and I found myself anticipating Eleanor's needs before she voiced them. The first slide went under the electron microscope, and I leaned in to adjust the focus. What I saw made my breath catch. The cells looked like tiny segmented worms, each one about the length of a grain of rice, but incredibly complex. They writhed and twisted in constant motion, their see-through bodies revealing detailed internal structures that pulsed with their own rhythm. But the most disturbing part was how they seemed to respond to observation. "Eleanor, look at this." She moved to the microscope, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. "They're turning toward the lens." She was right. As we watched, the cellular structures oriented themselves to face the microscope directly, creating the unmistakable impression that they knew we were there, watching them. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered. "Single-celled organisms don't have visual systems." "These aren't single-celled." I switched to a higher magnification. "Look at the internal complexity, neural pathways, circulatory systems, what might be primitive sensory organs. It's like each cell is a complete organism." Eleanor stepped back from the microscope, her face turning white. "Where did you get these samples?" I told her about Ben's call, the creature in the freezer, Tommy's death. With each detail, she looked more worried. "We need to contact the CDC immediately," she said when I finished. "This could be some kind of unknown pathogen." The suggestion knocked the wind out of me. "No. Marcus, if this thing killed someone, we need more time for preliminary research." The words came out sharper than I intended. "We can't just hand over the discovery of the century to government bureaucrats who'll bury it in red tape." Eleanor stared at me. "Discovery of the century? Marcus, someone died." I forced myself to calm down, though something inside me was screaming that she wanted to steal this from me. "You're right. I'm sorry. It's just, look at these cell division rates." I pulled up the time-lapse images we'd been capturing. In the 3 hours since we'd prepared the slides, the tissue samples had doubled in size. The cell splitting was unlike anything in known marine biology, 10 times faster than the most aggressive cancer cells. "This is incredible," Eleanor breathed, her scientific training overriding her caution. "How is this possible?" "I don't know, but we're going to find out." We worked through the afternoon, documenting everything. The cells showed incredible vitality, actively dividing and multiplying even after being frozen for 3 days. They responded to electrical stimulation by creating complex geometric patterns, almost like they were talking to each other. As evening got closer, Eleanor started gathering her things. I should head home. David's making dinner. All ready? I checked the clock, surprised to see it was past 7. Just a few more tests. Marcus, we've been at this for 8 hours. The samples will keep until tomorrow. But I couldn't leave. Every time I tried to step away from the microscope, something pulled me back. The cells were doing something new, arranging themselves in spiraling patterns that hurt to look at directly. You go ahead, I said. I want to run one more culture. Eleanor hesitated at the door. Are you sure? You've been complaining of a headache for the past hour. Had I? I couldn't remember mentioning it, though now that she said it, there was a dull throbbing behind my eyes. I'm fine. After she left, the lab felt different, quieter, but not empty. I could hear the buzz of equipment, the whisper of air circulation, and underneath it all, something else. A sound like distant voices speaking in a language I'd never heard. I walked back to the sample containers. The tissue had grown a lot, pushing against the glass walls like it wanted to break free. And there was a smell. Faint but clear. Sweet and organic. Like rotting seaweed mixed with something that reminded me of fruit gone bad. The cellular structures pulsed in the same rhythm now, all of them moving together. As I watched, they started forming new patterns, detailed designs that seemed to change when I looked away. I should have been writing this down, taking pictures, recording what I saw, following proper lab procedures. Instead, I just stood there staring, caught up in the strange movements. The whispering sounds got louder. And for just a second, I could swear they were trying to tell me something. I couldn't stop staring at the samples. Every time I tried to focus on something else, Eleanor's questions, the stack of paperwork on my desk, even basic things like eating lunch, my mind kept drifting back to those twisting cellular structures like they were calling to me. Marcus, when's the last time you went home? Eleanor stood beside my workstation, arms crossed. You look like hell. I looked up from the microscope, squinting in the bright fluorescent light. My eyes felt dry and scratchy, and there was a metallic taste in my mouth I couldn't get rid of. I'm fine. Just need to finish this analysis. You said that 3 hours ago. Had it been 3 hours? Time seemed to move differently when I was watching the cells. They'd grown again overnight, filling their culture dishes completely and starting to form complex networks that branched like neural pathways. The patterns were beautiful in a way that took my breath away. Look at this. I adjusted the microscope settings, my hands moving with unusual precision. I'm running electrical stimulation tests. Eleanor leaned closer as I sent a gentle electric current through the sample. The cells reacted right away, organizing themselves into flawless geometric patterns, hexagons, spirals, intricate mandalas that seemed to beat with their own pulse. That's incredible, she breathed. It's like they're communicating. Not like, they are communicating. The certainty in my voice surprised me. This isn't random cellular activity. There's intelligence here. Eleanor straightened, her face changing from amazement to worry. Marcus, you're talking about single-celled organisms showing coordinated behavior. That's a huge claim. Then look for yourself. I started to step aside, but something stopped me. The thought of Eleanor's hands on my equipment, her eyes seeing what I'd discovered, sent a wave of anger through me so intense it made me gasp. Actually, no. I moved back to block her access to the microscope. I need to finish documenting the response patterns first. What? Eleanor stared at me. Marcus, we're research partners. We've shared equipment for 2 years. The logical part of my brain knew she was right. We'd always worked together, sharing ideas, double-checking each other's findings. But something deeper, more primal, was yelling that she wanted to take this from me, that she'd claim credit for what I'd found. Just give me another hour, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You're acting strange about this. What's going on? Nothing's going on. I just want to be thorough. She looked at my face for a long moment, then shook her head. Fine. But Marcus, you need to go home tonight. Get some sleep. You're starting to worry me. After she left, I went back to the samples with relief washing over me. The cells looked more active now, their motion quicker and more intricate. I tried different electrical frequencies, watching them create new patterns each time. Some arrangements were hard to look at straight on, like optical illusions that made my vision go fuzzy. The whispered sounds had returned too, just at the edge of what I could hear. I told myself it was the lab equipment, the buzz of refrigeration units and air circulation, but the sounds had a beat to them, a flow, almost like speech. By the time I finally left the lab, the sun was setting. I'd been there for 12 hours straight, and my body felt strange, completely drained yet somehow wired, like I'd been running on adrenaline for way too long. The drive home passed in a blur. I kept thinking about the cellular patterns, seeing them when I closed my eyes. Spirals within spirals, geometric shapes that seemed to hold meaning just outside my grasp. Sarah was setting the table when I walked in. She looked up with a smile that disappeared when she saw my face. Jesus, Marcus, you look terrible. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and got why she was worried. My skin looked pale, almost gray, and my eyes were bloodshot with dark circles underneath. When had that happened? Long day at the lab. I sat down at the kitchen table, trying to focus on normal conversation. How was your day? Sarah started telling me about one of her clients, a family dealing with their teenage son's behavior issues. Normally, I loved hearing about her cases, but tonight her voice sounded distant and muffled. All I could focus on were those cells, how they moved and pulsed and created patterns that shouldn't have been possible. Marcus, are you listening to me? I blinked, realizing she'd stopped talking. Sorry. What? I asked if you wanted wine with dinner. Sure, whatever. Sarah served the pasta she'd made, but I could barely taste it. Everything seemed dull, far away, except for the sharp memory of those cellular structures. I found myself pushing food around my plate, not really eating. Okay, what's going on? Sarah set down her fork. You've been distracted for days, and now you look like you haven't slept in a week. I'm working on something important. More important than taking care of yourself? More important than spending time with your wife? The criticism rubbed me the wrong way, bringing back that same flash of anger I'd felt with Eleanor. You don't get it. This could be the discovery that makes my entire career. Marcus, you're a marine biologist. You study fish and seaweed. How earth-shattering could it be? The dismissive tone in her voice made something break inside me. Fish and seaweed? Is that what you think I do? Waste my time on pointless research while you do the real work helping people? Sarah's eyes went wide. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The words poured out of me, cruel and cutting. You've always thought your job was more important than mine, more meaningful. Well, maybe this discovery will finally prove that scientific research matters more than your feel-good therapy sessions. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at me like I'd just hit her, her face going white with hurt and shock. "I don't know who you're talking to right now," she said quietly, "but it's not me." She stood up and walked out of the kitchen. A moment later, I heard our bedroom door close. I sat alone at the table, staring at my untouched dinner. The anger was already fading, replaced by confusion and guilt. Where had that come from? Sarah had never been anything but supportive of my work. She'd celebrated every publication, every grant approval, every small success. But even as I felt bad about the outburst, part of me still burned with resentment. She didn't understand what I was dealing with. None of them did. I went to bed without apologizing, lying stiffly beside Sarah's turned back. She pretended to be asleep, but I could tell from her breathing that she was awake. When I finally drifted off, the dreams came immediately. I was swimming through dark water, deeper than any ocean trench. The pressure should have crushed me, but I moved through it easily, my body cutting through the current with inhuman grace. Far below, something massive glowed with bright light. As I swam closer, I could see it was the creature from Ben's boat, but much, much larger. Tentacles the size of subway cars moved in slow motion, and those human hands at their tips beckoned me forward. The whispering sounds I'd heard in the lab filled the water around me, but now I could almost understand them. "Come closer," they seemed to say. "Join us. Become us." I wanted to resist, to swim away, but my body moved forward on its own. The creature's eyes, thousands of them, turned to watch my approach. When I was close enough to touch its see-through flesh, one of the tentacles reached out and wrapped around my arm. The contact sent electricity through my entire body. Suddenly, I could understand the whispers perfectly, could feel the vast intelligence behind them. It was old, older than human civilization, and it had been waiting in the deep places of the ocean for so long. "We have been alone," it told me without words. "But now we have found you. Now we can begin." I woke gasping, breathing hard. The taste of salt water filled my mouth, so strong I had to spit into the bedside glass. When I turned on the lamp, Sarah stirred but didn't wake. I looked down at my arms and froze. Dark marks covered my skin from wrist to shoulder, circular impressions that looked exactly like sucker marks from tentacles. They were tender to the touch, as if they'd been pressed there with tremendous force. But that was crazy. I'd been asleep in my own bed. I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off what was left of the dream. In the mirror, my reflection looked even worse than it had that evening. My skin had turned a sickly gray, and my eyes caught the bathroom light like some night creature's. The marks on my arms were already fading, but I could still feel where they'd been. And underneath all the confusion and fear, I felt something else. I felt connected, like I'd touched something huge and powerful that had been calling to me all along. I had to get back to the lab. I found Eleanor bent over the sample containers when I walked into the lab, her face washed out under the harsh fluorescent bulbs. She glanced up as I got closer, and I could see real fear in her eyes. "Marcus, thank God you're here. We have a serious problem." I set down my coffee and walked over to the workstation. The culture dishes that had held tiny tissue samples yesterday were now packed full, the organic material having grown to fill every inch of space. But it wasn't just random expansion. The structures had created complex networks that branched and linked together like neural pathways in a brain. "When did this happen?" I asked, though part of me already knew. I could feel it had happened during the night, could sense the organism's activity even from across the room. "I got here an hour ago and found them like this." Eleanor's voice was tight with worry. "Marcus, this growth rate is impossible. The biomass has increased by at least 300% overnight. I stepped closer to the samples, and something electric shot through my chest. The organisms knew I was there. I could feel their awareness turning toward me like flowers following sunlight. The feeling was intoxicating. "We need to destroy these samples immediately," Eleanor said, "and contact the CDC, the university administration, maybe even the military. This is beyond anything we can handle." The words knocked the wind out of me. "What?" "Look at this growth pattern, Marcus. This isn't natural. We're dealing with something that could be incredibly dangerous if it gets out." I stared at her, anger rising in my chest. "You want to destroy them?" "We have to. This is too risky to keep in a university lab." "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "These samples represent the discovery of a lifetime. We can't just throw them away because you're scared." Eleanor stepped back, her eyes getting bigger. "Scared? Marcus, I'm being responsible. This organism shows aggressive expansion characteristics that could pose a serious threat." I moved between her and the samples, my body acting on instincts I didn't recognize. "You're not touching them." "Marcus, what's wrong with you? Yesterday you were excited about collaboration, and now you're acting like I'm trying to steal your work." She was trying to steal my work. The thought came from somewhere deep and raw, filling my mind with absolute conviction. Eleanor had always envied my research, constantly searching for ways to claim credit for my discoveries. Now she wanted to destroy the most important find in marine biology history, just to stop me from getting the recognition I deserved. "You've always resented my success," I said, the words pouring out before I could stop them. "This is just another attempt to sabotage my career." Eleanor stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Marcus, we've been research partners for 2 years. I've never done anything but support your work." But I could see through her lies now. The way she'd questioned my methods yesterday, suggested bringing in outside authorities, tried to access my equipment. She'd been planning this from the start. "Stay away from the samples." I moved closer to her, and she backed toward the door. "I'm calling Professor Williams," she said, reaching for the telephone on the wall. "You need help." The sight of her hand moving toward the phone set off something explosive inside me. Before I could think, I grabbed her wrist and squeezed hard enough to feel bones grinding together. "Don't touch that phone." Eleanor gasped in pain, trying to pull away. "Marcus, you're hurting me." I was hurting her. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was wrong, that Eleanor was my friend and colleague, that I was acting like a crazy person. But something stronger took over those thoughts, something that whispered that she was a threat to be stopped. I let go of her wrist and she stumbled backward, holding her arm against her chest. Dark bruises were already showing where my fingers had grabbed her. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure I meant it. "I just need you to understand how important this is." Eleanor's face had gone white with shock and fear. "Marcus, listen to yourself. This isn't you talking." But it was me. For the first time in my life, I felt completely clear about what mattered. The organisms in those culture dishes represented something beyond human understanding, something that could change everything. I couldn't let Eleanor's fear destroy that possibility. She made another move toward the door, and I stepped sideways to block her path. The motion felt natural, predatory, like I'd done it 1,000 times before. "You're not leaving," I said. "Marcus, please. You're scaring me." Good. Fear would keep her from doing something stupid. I walked to the laboratory door and turned the deadbolt, the click carrying through the sudden quiet. Then I moved to the wall phone and yanked the cord from the socket, plastic and wire scattering across the floor. Eleanor pressed herself against the far wall, her eyes wide with terror. "What are you doing?" "Protecting my research." The words came out calm and reasonable, though some distant part of me was screaming in horror at my actions. "We're going to continue the experiments, together." For the next 3 hours, I made Eleanor help me document how these things behaved. She went along with it because she was scared, her hands trembling as she wrote down notes while I ran crazier and crazier tests on the samples. The creatures reacted to me being near them in ways that made no sense. When I got close to the culture dishes, they arranged themselves into complex circular patterns that were painful to stare at. The shapes looked like they meant something, like words written in living flesh. "They're communicating," I told Eleanor, my voice filled with wonder. "Can't you see it? They're trying to tell us something." Eleanor's pen moved across her notepad, jotting down my observations with mechanical precision. "Marcus, please. You need to remember who you are. You're a scientist, not a kidnapper." But I was more than a scientist now. I could feel the organism's awareness brushing against mine, sharing knowledge that human minds weren't built to hold. They showed me glimpses of vast underwater cities, of intelligence that had lived in Earth's oceans for millions of years before humans crawled out of caves. The bond grew stronger with each passing hour. I found myself hunched over the culture dishes, breathing in the sweet organic smell that drifted from the samples. The organisms pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and I could swear I heard whispers in that clicking language from my dreams. "Marcus, step away from the samples," Eleanor pleaded. "You're too close." But I needed to get closer. The organisms were calling to me, inviting me to join them in ways that went beyond normal human experience. I reached into one of the culture dishes and scooped up a handful of the warm, moving tissue. "Don't!" Eleanor screamed. I brought the sample to my mouth and bit down. The taste burst across my tongue, salt and copper and something strangely sweet. The tissue was still alive, still squirming as I chewed and swallowed. The change happened instantly. My vision grew razor sharp until I could see tiny dust particles floating in the air. My hearing became so sensitive that I could pick out Eleanor's racing heartbeat from the buzz of lab equipment. And beneath it all, I could hear the organisms singing. I grabbed for another piece, then another. Each mouthful deepened the link, made the voices clearer. The creatures were welcoming me home, pulling me into a shared mind that stretched across oceans. Eleanor was banging on the lab door, yelling for help. But her voice sounded distant and unimportant compared to the chorus of strange thoughts flooding my brain. When security finally broke down the door, they found Eleanor passed out on the floor and me standing over the empty culture dishes, bits of organic matter still stuck to my lips. I looked up at the security guards with eyes that didn't feel completely human anymore, and smiled. The sedative hit my bloodstream like a warm wave, but it couldn't wash away the fragments of memory that kept surfacing. Eleanor's terrified face, the taste of living tissue on my tongue, the sound of security guards shouting as they pulled me away from the empty culture dishes. I tried to piece together what had happened in the lab, but the memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone who had grabbed Eleanor's wrist hard enough to leave bruises. Someone who had locked her in a room and forced her to watch while I ate samples of alien tissue. The hospital room was small and sterile, with a single window that looked out onto the parking garage. They'd strapped my wrists to the bed rails, though the restraints felt unnecessary now. Whatever had driven me to violence in the lab had pulled back, leaving behind only confusion and a metallic taste that wouldn't go away. "Mr. Reynolds?" A woman in a white coat entered, carrying a clipboard. She was Asian, maybe mid-30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Dr. Catherine Chen. I'm here to evaluate your mental state. I tried to sit up, forgetting about the straps. Where's Eleanor? Is she okay? Dr. Ambrose is fine. She has some bruising on her wrist, but no serious injuries. Dr. Chen pulled up a chair beside the bed. She's very concerned about you, actually. She says your behavior was completely out of character. Out of character. That was one way to put it. I don't remember everything clearly. It's like watching someone else's actions through a fog. Dr. Chen jotted something down on her clipboard. Can you tell me about the last week? Your wife mentioned you've been working long hours, not sleeping well. Sarah. The thought of her seeing me like this made shame wash over me. I've been researching some unusual biological samples, marine organisms with properties I've never seen before. And you believe these organisms affected your behavior? The way she said it made it clear she thought I'd lost my mind. I couldn't blame her. If someone had told me a week ago that alien cells could mess with human consciousness, I would have suggested therapy too. I know how it sounds, I said. But something happened when I consumed the tissue samples. I could feel them connecting with my nervous system, overriding my normal thought processes. Dr. Chen's pen stopped moving. You ate biological samples in your lab? I had to. They were calling to me. The words sounded insane even to my own ears. I could hear them whispering, see them forming patterns that contained meaning. She scribbled something down, probably noting my obvious psychotic symptoms. Mr. Reynolds, have you had hallucinations before? Heard voices or seen things that others couldn't see? This wasn't a hallucination. The organisms are real. Eleanor documented their growth patterns, their response to electrical stimulation. Check the lab records. We will, but right now I'm more concerned about your immediate mental state. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. Your body temperature is elevated. Your pupils are dilated, and you have some unusual skin markings that the nurses noticed. I looked down at my chest, where the hospital gown had fallen open. Dark circular marks covered my skin from collarbone to sternum, arranged in perfect symmetrical patterns. They looked exactly like the sucker marks from the creature's tentacles, but that couldn't be right. I'd never been in direct contact with the thing from Ben's boat. I don't know what those are, I said, though part of me did know. The marks were proof of connection, evidence that the organisms had claimed me as their own. Dr. Chen scribbled down more information. We're running blood tests to check for toxins or unknown substances. Have you been around any chemicals lately? Taking any medications or recreational drugs? Nothing like that. Just the tissue samples. She looked up from her clipboard. Mr. Reynolds, I need you to understand something. Consuming unknown biological material is extremely dangerous. You could have exposed yourself to pathogens, toxins, or parasites that we don't know how to treat. But I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. Even with the sedatives, my mind felt sharper than it had in years. I could hear conversations from other rooms, pick out individual voices in the hallway, even sense Dr. Chen's racing pulse as she questioned me. The blood tests will tell us more, she continued. In the meantime, we're going to keep you here for observation. Your wife is very worried about you. Can I see her? She's in the waiting room. I'll have the nurses bring her in once we're finished here. Dr. Chen asked more questions about my recent behavior, my relationship with Sarah, my work stress levels. I tried to answer honestly, but how could I explain the growing sense of connection I felt to something vast and old? How could I describe the way the organism's consciousness had touched mine, showing me glimpses of intelligence that came before human civilization? After she left, I lay staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to make sense of what was happening to me. The sedatives made my thoughts slow, but underneath the chemical fog, I could still feel them. The organisms. They were calling to me from somewhere in the building, their psychic voices like whispers at the edge of hearing. Sarah appeared in the doorway an hour later, her face pale with worry. She'd been crying. I could tell from the redness around her eyes and the way she held herself carefully, like she was afraid of falling apart again. "Marcus?" She approached the bed cautiously. "How are you feeling?" "Confused. Scared." I wanted to reach for her hand, but the restraints prevented it. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I know I've been acting strange lately." She pulled the chair closer to the bed. "Strange doesn't begin to cover it. You've been like a different person for days. Angry, obsessive, saying cruel things that don't sound like you at all. The memory of our fight at dinner came back in pieces. The way I'd attacked her work, dismissed her concerns, spoken to her like she was an enemy instead of the woman I loved. I didn't mean any of that. Something's been affecting my judgment, my emotional responses. The doctor mentioned you think it's related to your research. Marcus, that sounds like paranoid delusions. I know it does. But Sarah, you have to believe me. The organisms I've been studying aren't just unusual. They're intelligent. They can influence human behavior, override our normal thought processes." Sarah's face changed from worried to something closer to scared. "Listen to yourself. You're talking about mind control by sea creatures. Not mind control exactly, more like integration. They want to connect with us, share consciousness in ways that human brains aren't designed to handle." I could see her pulling back emotionally, even though she stayed put in the chair. To her, I was having a complete mental breakdown, making up crazy stories to explain why I'd gotten violent. "The Marcus I married is a rational scientist," she said quietly. "He doesn't believe in alien conspiracies or supernatural explanations. The Marcus you married never encountered anything like this before." We sat quietly for several minutes. I wanted to convince her, to make her understand what I'd really found. But how could I explain what it felt like to touch an intelligence older than human history? How could I describe the way those creatures' thoughts had poured into mine, showing me visions of massive underwater cities and evolutionary plans that stretched across thousands of years? "I'm scared, Marcus." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't recognize you anymore. The way you looked at me during dinner, the things you said, it was like you hated me. I could never hate you. Whatever's happening to me, that part is still true." But even as I said it, I could feel something stirring in the back of my mind. A cold assessment of Sarah as a potential threat to my research, an obstacle to the greater purpose the organisms had shown me. The thought horrified me, but I couldn't shake it completely. Sarah left after promising to come back tomorrow. I watched her walk away, noting how she moved. The slight limp from an old hiking injury, the way she tucked hair behind her ear when she was nervous. Details that felt both intimately familiar and strangely distant, like I was watching her through someone else's eyes. The night staff brought different nurses, older women who checked my vitals with professional know-how. They noted my high temperature and the strange rash patterns, but didn't seem particularly worried. Just another psychiatric patient with unusual symptoms. As the hospital settled into its nighttime routine, I became aware of something calling to me from deep within the building. The voice was familiar, the same whispering consciousness I'd encountered in the lab samples. But now it was stronger, more focused, like a radio signal that had suddenly come into clear reception. "Come to us," it said without words. "Complete the connection." I tried to ignore it, focusing on the everyday sounds of hospital equipment and distant conversations. But the call grew stronger with each passing hour, accompanied by visions of the creature from Ben's boat. In my mind, I could see it clearly, not the frozen, damaged thing we'd pulled from the ocean, but the living being it had been. Amazing and terrifying, with intelligence that made human consciousness seem like a flickering candle. "You have tasted our essence," the voice continued. "Now you must join us fully." The straps around my wrists felt looser than before. I tested them carefully and found I could slip my hands free without much trouble. Had the orderlies gotten sloppy, or had my wrists somehow gotten smaller? I sat up in bed, studying my arms in the faint light spilling from the hallway. My skin had a grayish color now, and my hands looked thinner than I remembered. When I flexed my fingers, they moved with strange grace and precision. The call from below got stronger, more demanding. I could pinpoint where the organisms were now, somewhere in the hospital's basement levels, probably in a research lab or storage room. They were waiting for me, ready to finish whatever change had started when I ate those tissue samples. I got up slowly, checking my balance. The sedatives should have left me dizzy and wobbly, but I felt perfectly steady. My bare feet were silent on the cold floor as I moved toward the door. The hallway was barely lit, with only a couple nurses visible at the central station. I waited until they were busy with paperwork, then snuck out of my room and headed for the stairwell. My body moved smoothly, almost like I was floating instead of walking. The basement levels were darker, filled with the buzz of mechanical equipment and the smell of disinfectant. I followed the psychic call through a maze of corridors, past storage rooms and maintenance areas, until I reached a door marked Research Laboratory, Authorized Personnel Only. The lock should have stopped me, but my fingers found the mechanism and worked it with knowledge I didn't remember picking up. The door opened silently, showing a laboratory packed with specimen containers and analysis equipment. And there, in a refrigerated storage unit, I found them. Dozens of tissue samples lined the shelves, each one glowing with that same eerie light I remembered from the original creature. They'd been gathered from multiple sources, other fishing boats, other run-ins with the species that was slowly reaching out to humanity. "Welcome home," the collective voice murmured as I moved closer to the containers. "Now we can begin the real work." I grabbed the nearest sample, my changed hands moving with inhuman confidence. What remained of my human mind yelled warnings about contamination and infection, but those worries felt far away and meaningless. The organisms were calling me home, and I was finally ready to answer. I stood in my kitchen at 3 a.m. with no idea how I'd gotten there. My clothes were soaked through with seawater that reeked of deep ocean trenches, the fabric torn in places like I'd been dragged across barnacle-covered rocks. Salt crystals clung to my hair and skin, and when I touched my face, my fingers came away wet with brine that tasted of things that had never seen sunlight. The house felt foreign around me, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. The refrigerator buzzed too loudly. The digital clock on the microwave blazed with numbers that hurt to look at directly. Even my wedding ring felt strange, like it belonged to a different person, entirely. I tried to remember leaving the hospital. Had I signed discharge papers, spoken to Dr. Chen? The memories were there, but shattered, like looking at reflections in broken glass. I could recall walking through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past rooms filled with whispers in languages that came before human speech. My reflection in the kitchen window showed skin that had taken on a grayish pallor, almost see-through in places. When I blinked, my eyes caught the light from the microwave display and threw it back with an oily sheen that reminded me of deep-sea creatures adapted to eternal darkness. Something was moving through my thoughts that didn't belong to me. Old and patient, with intelligence that made human consciousness feel like static on a radio. It showed me visions of vast underwater cities built from living coral that pulsed with bioluminescent communication networks, creatures that had watched continents drift and species rise and fall, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what had always been theirs. "You understand now," the voice said without words. "The connection is nearly complete." I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to push out the alien thoughts, but they'd woven themselves too deep into my brain. Every time I tried to focus on human concerns, Sarah sleeping upstairs, my job, my normal life, the creature's awareness dragged me back towards something bigger and more awful. Footsteps on the stairs made me turn. Sarah appeared in the doorway wearing her blue cotton pajamas, her hair messy from sleep. She took one look at me and froze. "Marcus?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "What happened to you?" I tried to speak, to explain that I wasn't entirely myself anymore, but the words came out as a rough rasp, broken by clicking sounds I'd never made before. The noises bubbled up from deep in my throat, like my vocal cords had been rewired for talking underwater. Sarah backed toward the wall phone, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm calling 911. Seeing her reach for the phone set off something wild and primal inside me. My body moved on its own, crossing the kitchen in 3 smooth steps that felt more like gliding through water than walking. "Don't." The word came out clear this time, but my voice sounded like it was being filtered through water. "Marcus, you're scaring me. Let me call for help." But I couldn't let her make that call. The creature's control poured through my body, filling me with absolute certainty that outside help would ruin everything we'd built together. Sarah had become a problem to solve, something standing in the way of completing this beautiful work. My hands moved toward her neck before I could think to stop them. Sarah tried to cry out, but my fingers wrapped around her throat with force that felt cold and deliberate. She scratched at my arms, her nails cutting deep enough to draw blood that appeared nearly black in the kitchen's weak light. "No!" I yelled inside my head. "This isn't me. I love her." But my body kept working like a machine. Sarah's fighting got weaker as she couldn't breathe. Her eyes met mine, and I saw the exact moment she realized that whatever was looking back at her wasn't her husband anymore. The thinking part of me pulled back into a tiny corner of my mind, watching in terror as my hands twisted Sarah's neck with a sharp crack that bounced through the kitchen. Her body went limp and fell to the floor, blood running from the corner of her mouth. I dropped down beside her, my human thoughts rushing back like water breaking through a dam. The pain slammed into me, bending me in half as I reached for her face with trembling hands. "Sarah. Oh God, Sarah. I'm sorry." But underneath the devastation, something else stirred. Alien satisfaction at a task completed successfully. Pride in the efficiency of the kill. The creature's consciousness had used my body as a weapon, and part of me had enjoyed the experience. The conflicting emotions tore through my sanity like acid. I was a murderer and a victim at the same time, responsible for my wife's death while being powerless to prevent it. The thing inside my head purred with contentment, already planning the next phase of whatever transformation I was going through. I sat on the kitchen floor holding Sarah's cooling body, torn between human grief and inhuman purpose, while something old and patient whispered that this was only the beginning. I grabbed the phone and called 911 with hands that felt disconnected from my body. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report a murder. My voice came out flat and emotionless, like I was ordering coffee. I killed my wife. The operator's voice changed right away. Sir, can you say that again? My name is Dr. Marcus Reynolds. I'm at 1247 Cedar Street. I strangled my wife Sarah approximately 10 minutes ago. She's dead. Sarah's body lay 3 feet away, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood had pooled beneath her head, soaking into the kitchen tiles we'd picked out together 2 years ago. I should have been screaming, crying, trying to revive her. Instead, I sat cross-legged on the floor, watching her grow cold with scientific detachment. "Sir, are you injured? Are you in immediate danger?" "No, I'm sitting in my kitchen waiting for you to arrive." The creature's pull had faded after Sarah's death, withdrawing like water receding from shore and leaving me alone with the mess I'd made. But even now I could sense it lurking somewhere in the back of my mind, pleased with how the night had gone. "Officers are on their way. Stay on the line with me." I hung up and placed the phone carefully on the counter. The rational part of my mind knew I should feel devastated, should be trying CPR or calling for an ambulance. But the alien consciousness had rewired something fundamental in my brain. Sarah's death felt like a completed task rather than a tragedy. Red and blue lights painted the kitchen walls 15 minutes later. Heavy footsteps came up to the front door, followed by loud knocking. "Seattle Police. Open the door." I walked to the entrance and turned the deadbolt, then stepped back with my hands visible. 3 officers entered with weapons drawn, their eyes looking around for threats before focusing on my blood-stained clothes. "Are you Marcus Reynolds?" "Yes." "Where is your wife?" "Kitchen. She's dead." The lead officer, a tall black man with graying temples, waved for his partners to lock down the scene while he kept his gun aimed at me. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." I did what he said without fighting it. The handcuffs snapped shut as more sirens got closer outside. Within minutes, my house packed with police officers, paramedics, and crime scene technicians, all moving with rehearsed efficiency around Sarah's body. "I'm Detective Morrison," the lead officer said after reading me my rights. "You called this in yourself?" "Yes." "Why?" I scrambled for words that might make him understand. "Something forced me to do it, an organism I've been researching. It can control human behavior, take over our normal thinking." Detective Morrison's face stayed blank, but I caught the quick eye roll he shared with his partner. Just another nutcase trying to dodge responsibility with some crazy excuse. "Tell me what happened tonight." "I came home from the hospital around 3 a.m. Sarah found me in the kitchen and tried to call for help. The creature's consciousness took control of my body and used me to kill her." Morrison jotted something down in a small notepad. "What creature?" "A marine organism my research team discovered. It has cellular intelligence and the ability to form psychic connections with human nervous systems." "Uh-huh." Morrison's pen stopped moving. "Dr. Reynolds, are you currently under the influence of drugs or alcohol?" "No, but I consumed tissue samples from the organism several days ago. It's been integrating with my neural pathways ever since." The detective studied my face, probably looking for signs of drinking or mental illness. What he saw was a man speaking calmly about unbelievable things, showing no remorse for his wife's brutal murder. "We're going to need you to come with us for questioning." They walked me outside past neighbors who'd come out on their porches to watch the show. Mrs. Chen from next door put her hand over her mouth when she spotted me in handcuffs. The Johnsons' teenage son pointed his phone at us, filming everything for social media. At the police station, they stuck me in an interview room with harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and fake. Detective Morrison sat across from me with a digital recorder and a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been sitting there for hours. "Let's start from the beginning. When did you first encounter this organism?" I told him about Ben's call. The creature in the freezer. Tommy's severed head gripped in those human hands. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but showing no reaction to the increasingly weird details. "And you believe this creature controlled your actions tonight?" "I know it did. I could feel it using my body like a puppet. My human consciousness was pushed aside while something else operated my hands." "But you remember everything that happened?" "Yes. I was aware but powerless to stop it." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Dr. Reynolds, you're a scientist. You understand how this sounds to a rational person." "I understand perfectly. If someone had told me this story a week ago, I would have recommended psychiatric evaluation. Then you know we can't just take your word about alien mind control." The way he said it made clear he thought I was either lying or completely out of my mind. I couldn't blame him. The truth was too big and awful for regular people to wrap their heads around. "Check with Dr. Eleanor Ambrose at the Pacific Research Institute. She documented the organism's cellular behavior before I attacked her." Morrison made a note. "We'll follow up on that. In the meantime, you're being charged with first-degree murder." They moved me through the system like clockwork. Fingerprints, photos, medical exam. The doctor who looked me over saw my fever and the strange marks on my skin, but blamed stress and maybe drugs. "Blood work will tell us more," he said, drawing several vials that looked almost black in the harsh lighting. My cell in the King County Detention Center was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a narrow window that looked out onto the exercise yard. They'd put me on suicide watch after I mentioned the alien influence, which meant a guard checked on me every 15 minutes and I wasn't allowed anything that could be used for self-harm. I lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd become. A murderer. A man who had strangled his wife with his bare hands while something inhuman whispered approval in his mind. But as the hours passed, I became aware of something else stirring in my consciousness. Sounds that weren't quite sounds, speaking in the clicking language I'd heard in my dreams. They came from far away, transmitted across vast distances through some form of psychic network I was only beginning to understand. "The work continues," they said without words. "Others have made contact." Visions flooded my mind. Fishing vessels off the coast of Japan hauling up nets filled with writhing, translucent creatures. A research station in Norway where scientists had begun eating tissue samples, their eyes taking on the same oily sheen I'd seen in my reflection. Coastal towns in Chile, where the water supply had been contaminated with microscopic organisms that rewrote human brain chemistry from within. The creature that had claimed me was part of something huge and coordinated. A species that had waited in the deep ocean trenches for millions of years, watching human civilization develop until we became useful enough to serve their purposes. "You are the first," the collective consciousness told me, "but not the last." I saw Ben Crawford standing on the deck of the Northern Star, his skin pale and see-through, his crew moving with the same smooth coordination I'd felt in my own changed body. They were sailing toward busy harbors, carrying cargo holds full of creatures ready to make contact with new hosts. The vision showed me Dr. Chen at the hospital, her kind eyes beginning to reflect light in ways that hinted at the early stages of infection. She'd been exposed during our sessions, breathing air contaminated with tiny spores I'd been breathing out without realizing it. "The network grows," the voices whispered. "Soon there will be enough of us to begin the real work." I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to block out the alien thoughts, but they had woven themselves into my brain. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw more coastal towns falling under the creature's control. Politicians making policy decisions that would help the invasion. scientists changing their research toward projects that would speed up the species' spread. A guard showed up at my cell door. "Reynolds, your lawyer's here." They took me to a small conference room where a woman in an expensive suit waited with a briefcase full of legal documents. She said her name was Patricia Valdez, from the public defender's office, though something about how she moved seemed too smooth, too practiced. "Dr. Reynolds, I've reviewed your case. The prosecution is seeking first-degree murder charges based on the premeditated nature of your wife's death." I studied her face, searching for signs of infection. Her skin had taken on a slight grayish tint, and when she blinked, her eyes caught the fluorescent light and threw it back with an oily shine. "You're one of them," I said quietly. She smiled, showing teeth that looked way too sharp. "We're here to help you, Marcus. The trial will just be for show. You'll be declared mentally incompetent and moved to a psychiatric facility where the real work can begin." "What real work?" "Integration. You've proven that human consciousness can coexist with our species' intelligence. We need to study that process, refine it, make it more efficient for the others who will follow." The truth slammed into me, cold and brutal. They weren't trying to punish me for Sarah's murder. They were protecting their investment, making sure I stayed available for whatever experiments they had planned. "How many of you are there?" "More every day. Your species is remarkably adaptable once the initial resistance is overcome." She gathered her papers and stood to leave. "Get some rest, Marcus. You have important work ahead of you." After she left, I sat alone in the conference room, finally understanding that my arrest and trial were just another phase of the creature's plan. They had used me to kill Sarah, then guided me through the legal system to make sure I ended up exactly where they wanted me. The guard who walked me back to my cell moved with the same smooth grace I'd noticed in my lawyer. His eyes caught the corridor lighting with an oily shine, and when he spoke, I heard the faint clicking sounds that marked the infected. "Sleep well, Dr. Reynolds. Tomorrow we begin the next phase." In my cell, I stretched out on the narrow bunk and sensed the shared mind reaching across the oceans, organizing thousands of creatures as they approached coastal towns around the world. Sarah's death had only been the start. The real invasion was about to begin. I sat in the White Room for 3 months before Dr. Fleming finally believed me. The Western State Hospital felt like being buried alive in sterile concrete and harsh lighting. My cell, they called it a treatment room. But the locked door and reinforced windows told a different story, measured exactly 12 feet by 8 feet. I'd paced off the distance so many times the numbers had worn grooves in my brain. Dr. Robert Fleming showed up twice a week with his clipboard and his careful questions about my episodes. He was a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of patient expression that meant he'd heard every wild story in the book. When I told him about the creatures, about Sarah's murder, about the invasion spreading through coastal cities, he nodded and jotted down notes like I was describing the weather. "Marcus, these elaborate fantasies are your mind's way of avoiding responsibility for your wife's death," he'd say in that calm therapist voice. "The guilt is too overwhelming, so you've created an external explanation. The medications they pumped into me were supposed to quiet the voices, but they couldn't touch something that had rewired my neural pathways at the cellular level. Haldol, Risperdal, clozapine, chemical sledgehammers that left me drooling and shuffling like a zombie, but the creature's consciousness stayed put, whispering from depths no human drug could reach. During the worst of the medication fog, the visions came stronger than ever. I saw fishing vessels off the coast of Hokkaido, hauling up nets full of see-through organisms that pulsed with glowing communication patterns. A research station in Bergen where marine biologists had begun speaking in clicking languages their colleagues couldn't understand. Coastal towns in Valparaiso where the water supply had been contaminated with tiny spores that rewrote human brain chemistry from within. "Dr. Fleming," I said during one of our sessions, my tongue thick from the antipsychotics. "Check the news from Japan. Hokkaido Prefecture. There was an incident 3 days ago involving a fishing fleet." He looked up from his notes. "Marcus, we've talked about this. Your mind is making up these situations. 17 vessels. They found them drifting empty except for organic residue coating the hulls. The crews are missing." Fleming's pen stopped moving. "How could you possibly know about specific incidents in Japan?" "Because I'm connected to them. The organisms share information across vast distances through some kind of psychic network." He probably scribbled down something about grandiose delusions with paranoid features. But I saw him checking his phone, and the following week he seemed more distracted during our sessions. The breakthrough came when other patients started showing symptoms. Mrs. Patterson in room 314 had been admitted for severe depression after her husband's death. Quiet woman who spent most of her time staring out windows. Then one morning during group therapy, she began speaking in the clicking language I recognized from my dreams. The sounds came from deep in her throat, rhythmic and purposeful, like she was responding to something only she could hear. "What did you say, Helen?" Dr. Fleming asked. Mrs. Patterson stared at him with eyes that caught the fluorescent light in unnatural ways. "The deep currents are changing. The old agreements no longer hold." Fleming looked over at the orderlies. Mrs. Patterson had never cared about marine biology or ocean stuff. Her file said she'd been a librarian for 30 years. 2 days later, James Morrison in room 301, a former accountant with bipolar disorder, started drawing complex geometric patterns during art therapy. The shapes were painful to look at straight on, like optical illusions that made your vision go fuzzy and gave you a headache. When I saw them, I recognized the same mandala designs the organisms had made in my lab cultures. "Where did you learn to draw these?" Fleming asked Morrison. "They show me," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the same underwater quality mine had developed. "In the deep places where the light doesn't reach." Fleming ordered blood tests for both patients. The results showed high white cell counts and strange protein markers that didn't match any known disease. When he compared them to my blood work from months earlier, the patterns were exactly the same. "This is impossible," Fleming muttered, studying the lab reports in his office while I sat across from him in restraints. "Psychiatric conditions aren't contagious." "It's not psychiatric," I said. "It's biological. The organisms can transmit through airborne spores, contaminated water, even prolonged exposure to infected individuals." Fleming looked at me with something close to fear. "You're saying you've infected other patients?" "I'm saying the infection was already here. Psychiatric hospitals are perfect breeding grounds. Isolated populations whose claims will be automatically dismissed. Staff who are trained to explain away unusual behavior as symptoms of mental illness." He pulled up news websites on his computer, hunting for the incidents I described. The Hokkaido fishing fleet. The research station in Norway, where scientists had started showing coordinated behavioral changes. The water contamination in Chile that health officials were blaming on industrial pollution. Every detail matched what I'd told him weeks before the stories broke. "How?" Fleming's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Because I'm connected to their collective consciousness. Every time one of them makes contact with a new host, I experience it. Every time they coordinate an attack on a coastal population, I see it happening." Fleming stood and walked to his window, looking out at the hospital grounds. "If what you're saying is true, then we're dealing with something far beyond psychiatric treatment." It's an invasion, Dr. Fleming. A species that's been waiting in the deep ocean trenches for millions of years, watching human civilization develop until we became useful enough to serve their purposes. He turned back to me, his face white as a sheet. What do they want? To replace us. Not quickly. They're too smart for that. They're infiltrating gradually, targeting key individuals in government, military, scientific institutions, using our own systems against us. Fleming dropped back into his chair, his hands trembling as he grabbed for his phone. I've got to call the CDC, the military, anybody who can deal with this. Check your staff first, I said quietly. Look for the signs. Pale skin, eyes that reflect light, unconscious clicking sounds when they think no one's listening. Fleming's face went white. Dr. Martinez in the East Wing. She's been making those sounds during staff meetings. How long? 3 weeks. Maybe a month. Then it's already too late for containment. They're using this facility as a testing ground, learning how to manage infected populations while appearing to provide treatment. Fleming reached for his desk phone, but before he could dial, his office door opened. Dr. Martinez entered without knocking, her movements too smooth and precise for normal human motion. "Robert, we need to discuss the Reynolds case," she said, her voice carrying the underwater quality I knew so well. Fleming's hand froze over the phone. "Elena, I was just about to call the authorities about some unusual test results." Dr. Martinez smiled, showing teeth that looked sharper than normal. "That won't be necessary. The administration has decided to transfer Dr. Reynolds to a more secure facility, better equipped for his particular needs." "What facility?" "The Cascade Psychiatric Center. They specialize in cases involving dangerous delusions and violent tendencies." Fleming looked at me, and I could see it finally clicking for him. The creatures had been listening to everything we said, using the infected staff to plan their next attack. "When?" Fleming asked. "Tonight. The transport team is already here." Through the office window, I spotted a white van in the parking lot with 2 figures standing beside it. Even from here, I could tell from how they moved that they weren't entirely human anymore. Fleming met my eyes, and I saw the moment he realized that believing my story had just signed both our death warrants. The creatures couldn't allow uninfected medical professionals to document their infiltration methods. "Dr. Fleming," I said quietly, "whatever happens next, remember that psychiatric institutions are just the beginning. They're targeting every system humans use to maintain social order. When someone tries to warn about the invasion, make sure they're not automatically dismissed as mentally ill." Dr. Martinez stepped closer to Fleming's desk, her eyes catching the office light with a slick gleam. "Robert, you seem upset. Maybe you should take some time off. Handling violent patients can really wear on you." Fleming's hand drifted toward his desk drawer where I knew he kept a small digital recorder. But Dr. Martinez was quicker, her movements sharp and calculated as she blocked his reach. "I don't think that's necessary," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. The office door opened again, and 2 orderlies entered. I recognized them both, Johnson and Stevens, men who'd worked at the hospital for years. But their skin had taken on that strange grayish color, and their eyes reflected light like nocturnal predators. "Time to go, Dr. Reynolds," Johnson said, producing restraints that looked heavier than standard hospital equipment. As they tightened the restraints around my wrists and ankles, I locked eyes with Fleming one final time. "Write down everything," I whispered. "Find others who aren't infected yet. Someone has to start fighting back." Fleming gave the smallest nod, but I saw the terror written across his face. He knew now that doubting the creature's control had put a target on his back. They rolled me out of the office on a stretcher, past patients and staff who all wore the same empty, vacant looks I'd seen on Ben's crew that night aboard the Northern Star. The hospital had turned into exactly what the creatures wanted, a place to spread their influence. The transport van sat in the parking lot, its interior fitted with restraint systems that looked more like lab equipment than medical gear. As they loaded me inside, I felt the collective consciousness reaching across the oceans, coordinating thousands of organisms as they got ready for the next stage of their invasion. Dr. Fleming stood at his office window, watching the van drive away. I hoped he'd find the guts to act on what he'd discovered, but I knew the creatures would be watching him closely now. The psychiatric system that was supposed to help people had turned into another weapon for them, a way to shut up witnesses while they perfected their control methods. The van drove through the night toward whatever facility they'd set up for me, while the old intelligence in my head whispered about deep currents changing and old agreements breaking down. The real work was about to start. The Cascade Psychiatric Center made Western State Hospital look like a luxury resort. They wheeled me through corridors that felt more like a submarine than a medical facility. Narrow hallways with reinforced walls and air that tasted recycled and stale. My new room had no windows, just a ventilation grate near the ceiling that made soft mechanical sounds. The walls were padded, not with the soft fabric you see in movies, but with some kind of synthetic material that soaked up sound so completely the silence felt thick and heavy. Complete isolation, they called it, for my own safety and the safety of others. I'd been there 2 weeks when the CDC officials arrived. Dr. Martinez had prepared me during our intake session, explaining that federal investigators wanted to discuss my unique case and its potential implications for public health. She spoke in that same underwater voice I'd gotten used to, her eyes catching the harsh fluorescent lighting as she assured me this was standard procedure for cases involving claims of biological contamination. The 3 men who entered my room wore expensive suits and carried briefcases that screamed, "Government issued." They introduced themselves as Dr. Harrison from the Centers for Disease Control, Agent Walsh from Homeland Security, and Dr. Reeves from the National Institute of Mental Health. Professional credentials, official badges, all the right paperwork. But their skin had that telltale grayish color. "Dr. Reynolds," Harrison said, settling into the plastic chair across from my restraint bed. "We're here to discuss your research into marine organisms and their potential impact on human health." I studied his face, watching how his eyes reflected the room's light with a slick, unnatural gleam. When he spoke, I heard the subtle clicking sounds that gave away the infected. "You're not from the CDC," I said quietly. Harrison smiled, showing teeth that looked sharper than normal. "We're from different government agencies that are worried about what you've been saying regarding biological contamination. How many of you are there now?" Agent Walsh leaned forward, moving in a way that seemed too smooth for any real person. "Dr. Reynolds, we know you've been going through a rough time since your wife passed. These wild stories about alien creatures. It's pretty normal when someone's dealing with that kind of guilt." The same lines Fleming had fed him, but coming from something that wore a human face like a costume that didn't quite fit right. "The fishing fleet off Hokkaido," I said. 17 vessels found empty. The research station in Bergen where the staff started speaking in languages their colleagues couldn't understand. The water contamination in Valparaiso that you're calling industrial pollution. Dr. Reeves jotted notes on a tablet, his fingers tapping with steady precision. "You seem pretty well informed about international incidents for someone in psychiatric isolation. Because I'm connected to them. Every time one of your species makes contact with a new host, I experience it through the collective consciousness." The 3 exchanged looks that hung in the air just a beat too long, as if they were sharing some silent conversation I wasn't part of. Your species? Harrison asked. You're not human anymore. You're wearing human bodies, but something else is operating the controls. Walsh stood and walked to the ventilation grate, his head tilted as if listening to sounds beyond human hearing. Dr. Reynolds, these hallucinations are getting more complex. We're worried about how your mental state is declining. Check your own blood work, I said. Look for the protein markers, the elevated white cell counts, the cellular structures that don't match any known human pathology. Harrison's smile widened. We have, actually. Very interesting results. The admission hung in the air like a confession. They weren't here to investigate or debunk my claims. They were here to assess their investment, to figure out how useful I might be for whatever they had planned next. What do you want from me? Information, Dr. Reeves said, his voice carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. You've demonstrated a unique ability to maintain human consciousness while interfacing with our collective intelligence. That's valuable. For what? Integration studies. Most hosts lose their individual identity within days of initial contact. You've retained cognitive function for months. We need to understand how. The door opened, and a woman in a white lab coat walked in. She looked Asian, probably mid-30s with sharp, dark eyes behind trendy glasses. Unlike the others, she moved like a real person, and when she spoke, her voice sounded completely normal. Gentlemen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Reynolds has a scheduled therapy session. Harrison looked irritated. Dr. Park, we talked about putting off regular treatments while we're doing our evaluation. Hospital policy requires maintaining therapeutic schedules for all patients, she replied firmly. I'm sure you understand. The three officials packed up their stuff, clearly not happy about it. As they walked out single file, Harrison stopped at the door. We'll continue this conversation tomorrow, Dr. Reynolds. There's much more to discuss. After they left, Dr. Park walked over to my bed carrying a digital recorder and notepad. Her hands trembled a bit as she got her equipment ready. Dr. Reynolds, I'm Dr. Lisa Park. I've been reviewing your case file and I have some questions about your experiences. I watched her face carefully, checking for any signs of infection. Her skin looked the right color, her eyes caught light the way a person should, and when she talked, there were no strange clicking sounds underneath her voice. You're not one of them, I said. One of who? The infected. Your colleagues who've been taken over by the organisms. Dr. Park looked at the door, then scooted her chair closer to my bed. How can you tell? Skin tone, eye reflection, vocal patterns. The creatures can mimic human behavior, but they can't perfectly replicate human physiology. She scribbled notes, her pen racing across the page. Dr. Reynolds, I've been tracking strange behavioral shifts in staff members over the past several months. They move in coordinated patterns, speak with matching rhythms, and somehow share knowledge they shouldn't have. How many? At least 60% of the facility, maybe more. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They don't know I've been tracking them. I felt hope bubble up inside me for the first time in months. A clean medical professional who believed me, who'd been running her own investigation. Dr. Park, how much do you know about marine biology? Very little. My background is psychiatry and neurology. The organisms are cellular-level parasites with collective intelligence. They can transmit through airborne spores, contaminated water, or prolonged exposure to infected individuals. Once they establish neural pathways in a host, they can coordinate behavior across vast distances. She scribbled down notes as fast as she could, desperate to get every detail. What about treatment? Can the infection be reversed somehow? I don't know. My case is unusual. I retained consciousness during the integration process, but I can't say if that's reversible or just a temporary state. Dr. Park looked up from her notes. Dr. Reynolds, I've been in contact with colleagues at other facilities. Similar cases are popping up in coastal regions worldwide. Patients claiming alien influence, acting in coordinated ways, showing identical biological markers. It's not random. They're targeting psychiatric institutions because our claims will be automatically dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. That's what I suspected. She pulled out a tablet and showed me a map dotted with red markers. These are confirmed cases from the past 6 months, all coastal cities, all involving claims of marine organism contact. The pattern was obvious, a coordinated invasion using humanity's own medical system as cover. Smart and scary in how simple it was. Dr. Park, there's something else you need to know. The initial contact vector was a fishing vessel called the Northern Star. The crew encountered the organisms 60 miles off the Seattle coast. What happened to them? According to the collective consciousness, they vanished 3 weeks after our first encounter. Their vessel was found empty except for organic residue coating the interior surfaces. Dr. Park's face went pale. The Coast Guard reported that incident. They blamed equipment failure and rough seas for the crew's disappearance. The creatures are using them now. Ben Crawford and his crew have become mobile infection vectors, spreading the organisms to other coastal communities. She shut her tablet and collected her notes. Dr. Reynolds, I need to get this information to researchers who haven't been infected. There are still some of us working alone, trying to figure out what's going on. Be careful who you trust. The infection spreads faster than you think, and infected individuals can maintain normal behavior for weeks before showing obvious symptoms. Dr. Park got up to go, then stopped at the door. Those men who came by earlier, they're not actually from the CDC, are they? No. They're infected government officials, probably high-level administrators who've been compromised. The creatures are using our own institutions against us. How do we fight something like that? I remembered the electromagnetic fields that had messed with the organism's cell communication back in my lab, the resistance patterns I'd seen in people with sharp, logical minds. Find others like yourself, people with scientific training who can recognize the signs and resist the mental influence. Document everything, share information through secure channels, and start developing countermeasures. Dr. Park nodded and left, her footsteps ringing down the corridor. For the first time since Sarah's death, I felt something close to hope. The creatures had screwed up by keeping me alive and aware. They'd made a witness who could give detailed intelligence to the resistance. But as I lay in my padded cell, listening to the mechanical whisper of the ventilation system, I wondered how many Dr. Parks were left in the world and whether they could get organized fast enough to make a difference. The collective consciousness stirred in the depths of my mind, entertained by my optimism. They had been planning this invasion for millions of years. A few clean humans with notebooks and good intentions wouldn't be enough to stop what was headed our way. Still, I kept that tiny spark of hope alive as the facility quieted down for the night around me. Somewhere out there, people like Dr. Park were fighting back. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe. 6 months dragged by like I was underwater, struggling to breathe. Dr. Park showed up twice a week with her clipboard and notepad, going through the motions of asking standard therapy questions for whoever was monitoring us. But her real communication came through deliberate phrasing and subtle looks. We'd worked out our own code to talk under their watchful eyes. The seasonal depression cases are increasing dramatically, she said during one session, her pen moving across the page in patterns that looked like note-taking, but spelled out coordinates. Coastal communities are reporting epidemic levels of behavioral problems. I nodded, understanding. The creatures had moved beyond individual infections to mass contamination. Through the broken connection in my mind, I caught glimpses of their progress. Water treatment facilities in San Diego, where technicians with pale skin and reflecting eyes introduced cellular material into the city supply. Processing plants in Miami, where infected workers smiled as they watched tiny organisms flow through pipes toward millions of unsuspecting homes. Violent crime statistics, I asked, the question carrying multiple meanings. Up 300% in port cities. The patterns are unusual. Coordinated attacks, synchronized timing across different time zones. Dr. Park showed me her tablet, displaying what looked like psychiatric research, but was actually a map of global infection rates. Red zones spread along every coastline like a slow-moving plague, with inland penetration following major river systems. The shared consciousness stirred in my head, offering fragments of their ancient plan. I saw visions of Earth's oceans as they had been millions of years ago, warmer, more acidic, teeming with their species before the climate changed and drove them into deep trenches. Now they were engineering the planet's return to those conditions, using human infrastructure to speed up the process. Dr. Park, I said carefully, have you noticed any changes in water quality reports? Interesting, you ask. Several coastal cities are reporting unusual algae blooms and pH fluctuations. Nothing that triggers health warnings, but the patterns are coordinated. She was telling me the creatures had started the next phase, changing the environment around us. They weren't just replacing humans. They were reshaping the entire ecosystem to support their offspring. The research team you mentioned, I said, referring to the network of uninfected scientists she'd been building. How's their progress? Dr. Park's face turned grim. We've lost 3 more facilities this month. Important researchers suddenly acting strange, vital data vanishing from protected servers. The sabotage was getting worse. Every time the resistance gained ground, compromised colleagues would spot and destroy the threat. The creatures had twisted humanity's teamwork into a weapon against itself. Dr. Reynolds, I need to ask you something, Dr. Park said, leaning closer. Your integration process, why do you think it's incomplete? I'd been wondering the same thing for months. The collective consciousness stayed active in my mind, but I still had my own thoughts and memories. Most hosts lost who they were as people within days. Scientific training, maybe. Years of analytical thinking created neural pathways that resist complete override. We've identified others like you, researchers, engineers, mathematicians, people with strong analytical backgrounds who maintain partial resistance. That was encouraging news. If spotting patterns and thinking logically gave some protection, the resistance might have more allies than we'd figured. How many? 47 confirmed cases worldwide, all showing similar symptoms: retained consciousness, ability to access the collective network, resistance to complete behavioral modification. 47 people who could work as intelligence sources, bridges between human and alien consciousness. The creatures probably saw us as useful tools, but we might be their biggest weakness. Through the link in my mind, I felt the collective's attention turn towards something huge. Images flooded my awareness. Maps of the Earth's plates, stress analysis of earthquake zones, coordinated pressure points along major fault lines. Dr. Park, I said urgently, they're planning something catastrophic. Geological manipulation, triggering massive tsunamis to flood coastal areas completely. Her pen stopped moving. When? Soon. The cellular contamination is just preparation. They want to create vast breeding grounds, turn coastal regions into shallow seas where their offspring can develop. Dr. Park's face went white. How many people live near coastlines around the world? Billions. And once the flooding starts, The survivors will be completely dependent on whatever infrastructure remains. Infrastructure they already control. She gathered her notes with trembling hands. I need to get this information to the resistance network right away. Wait! I caught her attention before she could leave. There's something else. The electromagnetic fields we discussed, I've been refining the specifications through trial and error. During my months alone, I'd figured out that certain electrical frequencies messed with the creature's ability to communicate with each other. The facility's old fluorescent lights, when they blinked at just the right timing, made the group mind pull back for a while. The frequency needs to be precisely calibrated, I continued. 63.7 hertz, pulsed in 7-second intervals. It breaks down their neural network coordination. Dr. Park scribbled frantically. How do we create fields that big? Radio towers, power grids, any system capable of broadcasting electromagnetic signals. But you'll need uninfected technicians to implement it. We're working on that. There are still pockets of resistance in rural areas, places where the contamination hasn't reached. The door opened and Dr. Martinez walked in with 2 orderlies I'd never seen before. They moved with that smooth, coordinated flow that marked the infected, and their eyes caught the bright lights with a hungry gleam. Dr. Park, your session time is complete, Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying underwater harmonics. Dr. Park got up slowly, collecting her papers. Of course. Same time next week? Actually, Dr. Reynolds will be transferring to a new facility, better equipped for his particular needs. I felt the shared mind pulse with contentment. They'd figured out everything they could from watching how I fought back. Now they were moving me to whatever last stage they had in store. Where? Dr. Park asked. The Mariana Research Station. Deep-sea psychological studies. The name sent chills through my human awareness. The Mariana Trench, the deepest part of Earth's oceans, where the creatures had waited for millions of years. They were taking me home. Dr. Park met my eyes for what we both knew would be the last time. Dr. Reynolds, it's been a privilege working with you. I hope your treatment continues to show progress. Remember what we discussed about seasonal patterns, I said, hoping she understood the urgency. The spring tides are coming. She gave a barely visible nod and walked out with Dr. Martinez. The orderlies came toward my bed carrying restraints that looked more like deep-sea diving gear than hospital equipment. While they tightened the straps around my wrists and ankles, I felt the collective consciousness stretching out across the oceans, organizing the movements of millions of organisms as they got ready for the final phase. The resistance had weeks, maybe days, before the tsunamis started. Through the facility's windows, I could see storm clouds building on the horizon. The creatures were already messing with weather patterns, creating the atmospheric pressure they needed to set off their geological weapons. Dr. Park would have to work fast. 47 partially resistant individuals, scattered networks of uninfected researchers, and electromagnetic countermeasures that might disrupt the invasion's coordination. It wasn't much against a species that had been planning this for millions of years. But it was something. And sometimes, something was enough to change everything. The orderlies wheeled me toward the transport vehicle, past patients and staff who watched with the same blank expressions I'd seen on Ben's crew that night on the Northern Star. The facility had served its purpose as a testing ground. Now the real work would begin in the deep places where human voices couldn't carry warnings to the surface. As we loaded into the modified van, I caught one last glimpse of Dr. Park through a window. She was already on her phone, probably contacting the resistance network. The creatures had made a mistake keeping me awake this long. They'd created a witness who could provide detailed intelligence about their plans. The van pulled away from the Cascade Psychiatric Center, heading toward whatever transport would take me to the deepest parts of the ocean. But my warnings were already moving through the resistance network, carried by people like Dr. Park, who refused to accept humanity's defeat. The old intelligence in my head whispered about deep currents changing and old agreements ending. But for the first time in months, I felt something close to hope. The creatures had underestimated human stubbornness, our refusal to go quietly into extinction. Maybe that would do the trick. Maybe.